Hi everybody, I'm Billy, and this is Antioch, Chapter 9, The Golden Rule. John rode his Pinto south toward Moreau, leading Aries on a rope. An hour after the crossroads to the farm, he saw a group trudging up ahead. Worried they were a mass of devils, he brought the horses to a stop. As the group approached, John noticed they had goats, small carts with chicken coops, and other supplies. At the front, waving and carrying his saddle over one shoulder, was Michael. John went to them, dismounted, and embraced his filthy, scarred, and tattered friend. The sailors gathered around them. The group's pace was slow. John walked next to Captain, who told some of what he knew while impressing with his matches and his pipe. To John he was a mysterious, black-skinned pirate, conjuring fire and breathing smoke. Captain said, "Zeke didn't tell us much about them, the Bowron. He'd no time for questions. That might have been why it happened the way it did for the Vesper. She didn't have our crew, of course, but had Zeke told them more?" Captain shrugged and paused for a smoke. No. He'd only time to tell us where to go. And now, after leagues of water and heartbreaking impossibilities, we've come, and found you, the strangest of all. I've wondered if you're even men. Drake spoke up from behind. "Well, they're not women, Captain. Look at the mustache on Michael." John brightened and clapped Michael on the back. "Ha! Michael, you're not a woman." Michael shook his head with a weak smile. He'd had quite enough of Drake by then. Drake went on. "Even Andolyn can't grow one like that." Andolyn hooded her eyes. She didn't have a mustache. Biggs grinned. There was a smile hiding in her face. For her, friendly teasing was a comfort. She didn't have many friends among the crew. Most of them avoided her or referred to her in secret by derogatory names like Army Mom and Shooty McShoot-Shoot. Michael scolded Drake. "Be careful, young man. That's an off thing to say to a woman. Show some courtesy." Drake smirked. John smirked too. Captain tried to redirect the conversation. "They've burned down the world, and you just walk through them. How do you do it?" John didn't respond. He behaved as though Captain had said nothing. It was the same with Michael any time he didn't want to answer a question about the church. They answered such questions with silence. Captain said, "Not ones to share your secrets, are you?" John pointed at Captain's pipe and changed the subject. "Why do you do that? Does it protect you from those devils?" Captain said, No, letting go of the other matter. "This is an herbal remedy that eases my condition. Land sickness, you see." He cleared his throat. Michael and John shared a dubious expression. Ditch adjusted his pack. "Whatever, man." Sailors stayed close to Michael and John during the long walk north, secrets or not. A sparse forest began to frame the road. The trees were long before their leaves and white like lonely bones. None grew close enough to touch another. The nights in those woods terrified the sailors. At sea their ship's height and cabin doors protected them, but on open land they were vulnerable. Their campfires made long, flickering shadows in the trees that looked like silent Bowron lurching from every direction. Michael and John took turns to rest. No sailor slept. Weeds penetrated cracks in the weathered path's mortar. 3 fires glowed by the roadside, but almost everyone huddled around the one near Michael. He sat on his saddle, hunched over a book with a quill pen, taking notes from the sailors' stories. They spoke in whispers, trying to avoid attracting any attention from what might be wandering in the woods. John lay sleeping with his back to a deserted fire 20 feet away. Captain said, "Let's talk about another thing or other. Being out here is one thing. Being out here and talking about them has me crawling out of my skin." Drake said, "Uh-oh, Captain, a Bowron's gonna get you," and broke the quiet with a dopey ooh, raising his arms and wiggling his fingers. Everyone stared at him in stark disbelief. Drake slapped his hands over his mouth, realizing he'd been too loud. Ditch splayed and hissed, "Shut up, you dumb stupid!" Other angry sailors shushed Drake and threw things at him. Then, as the group's shushing grew louder than the offense it punished, John started to snore. It was a phlegm-toothed snarl that gnawed on the edge of the sibilant din, drawing silence and worried glances. Michael got up and stopped it with a swat to John's boots. When Michael came back, he pointed at Drake and gave him a hard stare. Inappropriate. Drake shied away. Biggs said, "Yeah, I never heard one go ooh." Ditch apologized for Drake. "He's a dookus, man." Biggs chuckled. "A lot of us seen more'n people oughta, Michael. Oughta be nuttier than a case of fruitcakes." As usual, Michael had to rely on context for meaning. He picked up his book and tapped his quill in its little ink jar. "You said they eventually stopped smoking. How long does that take?" Biggs poked at the fire. "Not sure. Just seen some that don't. Or smoke less, I guess. Might be they run out. Been thinking they make it out of parts they don't need, like little factories. Michael's pen scratched the page as Biggs spoke. Never watched one for longer than it takes to put a bullet in 'em, but it's always the old ones that don't smoke. The ones that are real lean and settle down to muscle and bone. The fast ones. Captain covered his face and mouthed an ancient nursery rhyme to himself. A llama, a llama, a llama lying down. He hoped it would get stuck in his head and leave no room for thoughts about the developmental stages of Bowron. Ditch said, I hate the fast ones, man. They're like spiders or something, you know? Hard to hit. Michael said, I've not seen one I'd call fast. I'd say they barely move along. Andelin said, You have encountered the young. They are uncoordinated and struggle in their own flesh like a straitjacket. We have seen Bowron that would be impossible to outrun. It is unsettling. Michael thought of the lean horror chained in the Vesper's hold. The one in the ship must have been old. A twig snapped in the darkness, more alarming than a rifle going off. Michael stood up, dropped his book, and pulled his sword. The sailors held their breath. Everyone listened, trying to pick the sound of an approach out of the campfire's crackle. A Bowron wouldn't wait or be cautious. It would come right at them. A creature was out there, but it wasn't what they thought, or anything the sailors had ever heard of. Firelight shined in her eyes, amber, like those of a wolf. She paused after stepping on the twig, realizing it would alert the men by the fire. They smelled of sour milk. She stared at John without blinking and started coiling her strength. He was the most removed from the group. She could drag him out of the light before the others could react. Then, like a bear in a cave, John's snore returned. The creature's face flared and she shot straight up into the air. She landed scrabbling and bounded away. The sailors exhaled, imagining she'd been a curious deer or some such. Michael kept his sword drawn, though. He gave John's boots a swat strong enough to wake him up. John yawned and looked around with his eyes closed. Captain lit a match and held it to his pipe with trembling hands. Just an animal. That means there are no Bowron about then, right? He looked to Andelin. She said, Sometimes. Captain said, A puff or two to give me some ease. Ditch said, Man, grow up. That stuff's for kids, and it stinks. Captain dismissed Ditch with the usual defense. It's medicinal. I have a condition. He held the smoke in his lungs and passed his pipe to an eager Wells. Wells said, I'm sick too. Michael took longer to relax, thinking about what was out there stalking them. At least 3 books in the church bestiary applied to the woods between Antioch and Moreau. At the sailors' claims of being sick, however, Michael sheathed his Callaghan and returned to the conversation. You're not ill. They were in exceptional health. He'd made sure of it. Sailors snickered and smiled. Captain's eyes shifted while he waited for the pipe to make its rounds. He didn't need to explain himself to Michael. Neither hospital nor pipe smoking could replace sleep. Restless nights made the sailors grumble and drag their feet. They felt like they would never arrive. Then, as one morning's fog lifted and the forest's scent was heavy and moist, John and Michael pointed out hazy buildings in the inclining miles ahead, where the forest thinned into a field. The sailors were revived. Look, everybody! Yeah, man, look out! There it is! At last! Antioch! They celebrated, hugging and cheering. Their pace doubled. As they got closer, however, their jubilance gave way to concern, and their conversation focused on a glaring hole in the town's defense. No wall? There's no wall. Not even like a fence, man. It is defenseless. Ditch frowned at Drake. Man. Biggs went to Michael. Never even thought to ask. We'll help y'all put up a wall. We all want to help. Others supported him on that. Michael said, I don't know what the Fellowship is going to do about all this. It's their city. Biggs was surprised. But they'll listen to you, right? I know we're on our own when we get there and all, but they gotta listen to you guys about something like this. Michael answered the question carefully. Our influence is limited. They're more like our neighbors than anything else. Biggs didn't think Michael was taking the threat seriously enough. Those things are coming here. They find people, and when they do, they ain't gonna wait for you guys to show up. Michael nodded, not wanting to appear indifferent. Of course, I'll help however I can. A wall seems like a good idea to me. Captain tapped himself on the nose. First, the incinerator. Ditch added, a big one. Michael and John looked at each other, sharing unspoken concern over how the Fellowship would respond to the blasphemy of corpse burning, especially on a scale requiring an incinerator larger than the one on the Grace. What such a machine meant for the surrounding population sobered the 2 healers. Michael said, "John, I want you to ride ahead and get my father. I'll walk the sailors in from here." John said, "Of course. Here, I'll bring Ares in, too." A sign beside the road read Antioch above a painted bullseye of spiraling rings that represented the town's streets. The word church labeled a mark in the wide center. Northeast of that, on one of the inner rings, another mark read Bethenford's Inn. On the sign the inn was slightly more prominent than the church. It was Bethenford's sign, after all, but the governing principle of Antioch's construction was that every building fought for a spot closest to the Circle's house. The inner rings were the oldest streets. Townsfolk called out to each other and collected by the hundreds, whispering about the approaching group. They met with cautious curiosity. A human circle of sailors and citizens formed around Michael as he prepared to speak. The man standing next to Ditch stared at the tattoos. Ditch looked up at him, held out a hand, and said, "What's up, man? I'm Ditch." Surprised by the mean-looking little stranger's friendliness, the citizen shook hands with him and interpreted the unfamiliar greeting. "Oh, my, excuse me. How do you do?" Michael shouted, "Everyone, listen to me!" The crowd shushed each other to hear. Michael waited for their attention and then said, "These people are from oversea." He had to shout over gasps and murmurs after that. "By the grace of God, they've found you. You are their sanctuary. They've traveled very far. They're tired and hungry. Please, do for them as you would have them do for you." Questions swelled from all around about the sailors and Moreau. Guesses and rumors had stemmed from John's brief visit 2 weeks before, when he'd left Daniel at the cauldron, but neither any news of the tragedy nor any Bowron had yet come to Antioch. Michael's repetitive response, trying to add incentive to housing the sailors, was that they could tell the whole story. As he redirected attention to the sailors, Michael searched the milling crowd for his father. There was John. Next to him stood an older, bearded version of Michael in Antioch's brown and white, Deacon Bethenford. They pushed toward each other for a close conversation. Bethenford listened and nodded. Michael felt some relief then, for the sailors at least. He left. John followed him. The citizens discussed the announcement with astonishment, and the sailors held their breath. The crew of the Grace had known that moment would come. There was no room for 50 people at the church. Having been at the mercy of the smoke, the sea, and the circle, they were finally at the mercy of the fellowship. They had little time for worry, though. Bethenford took the crowd's attention and made a show of offering rooms at his inn to 10 sailors, including Drake, Ditch, and Biggs. Others followed his example and came forward, offering places in their homes. Captain chose then to light his pipe, receiving appreciative oohs and ahs and a prompt invitation from the candlemaker, Bing. Margot, a basket of vegetables on her head, asked Andolin to take the extra bed in Sarah's room. As sailors waved goodbye to one another and followed their hosts into the city, Biggs and Andolin made plans to meet the following morning. Andolin chose a seat at the far end of the table from Marabas in the cauldron's otherwise empty common room. Margot went into the kitchen. When Margot returned with cider, bread, cheese, and stew, Marabas had moved down. Andolin was rigid and tight-lipped, suspecting that he'd sniffed her. Margot set out the food and drinks gently. "It's a good life here, dear." She sat and started slicing apples onto a plate. "We'll do right by you and your friends. You'll see." Andolin gave her a mechanical smile. Margot said, "You know, people have been arguing forever over whether anyone was really oversea. I've heard stories about pirates coming to shore at night and mollycoddling folk out to the water for wicked revelries, but that's always sounded to me like they'd too much to drink and passed out on the beach." Andolin took a careful bite of the stew. She melted. The dish was an enchantment of hearty, tender meat, potatoes, and carrots, and a rich, beefy broth, homemade food. That bite ended a year of death and flight. She said, "Delicious." Margot beamed. "Oh, yes, Fergus is a wizard. That's my husband. His food's the only part of him I can get out of the kitchen. You should take a pull of that cider, dear. That's mine. Fergus says my brewing's why he married me." Andolin drank the cider and dipped the bread in the stew. The cheese was firm and tangy with a pan-seared crust. She ate chunks of it on sweet, crisp apple wedges. Andolin abandoned her guard with Margot, and even smiled at that hairy sniffer, Marabas. Sarah, Fergus, and Daniel came in gawking. Andolin's blonde hair and copper skin was unlike anything they'd ever seen. They ate together before business picked up at 5 o'clock. Guests gathered around and exchanged stories with Andolin for hours. She had already learned much about them from Michael and John, and heard those tales again. The fellowship was a religious community that had fled from persecution in the north 100 years before. Despite a sad and bloody history, they'd made a peaceful and happy home in the South when they'd found the church. They marveled at her tales of fallen civilizations and of encounters with the living dead on the high sea. It was of continual surprise to Andelin how they handled it all. They believed no harm would come to them, she assumed because of the church. The bell rang, and greeting shouts of "Davies!" vaulted from the room. Davies, the milkman, was 28 years old, and had arms like corded steel from squeezing teats. "Ha ha, yes! I heard you've got a sailor over here. Everywhere that does is packed. You won't believe it. They're just like us overseas, but look, she wears pants." Davies smiled like he'd heard an interesting joke. She? Then he saw Andelin's hair, and "Yellow!" burst out of his mouth. She raised an eyebrow at him. That simple, common expression told Davies everything he needed to know about sailors. He boomed laughter and shouted, "Well, that's Fergus. First contact, and he grabs a dishwasher." The room laughed with him. Then he told her, "No offense." Andelin was puzzled. The man seemed to be taunting her. The room treated Davies like a hero, offering him seats and information. Someone put a mug in his hand. He sat down opposite Andelin, who was no longer in conversation with anyone. The milkman drank cider and tried to respond to his peer's flooding, excited explanations. "No, I didn't know that. I've been at work all day, not gossiping. What's that about Moreau? Oh, well, they'll be in our prayers. Brayog? Who cares about them?" Jacob, a blacksmith as burly as the milkman, had been in the cauldron for an hour by then, and had met with Michael and John at the church before that. He raised an informed yet friendly challenge to Davies' quick dismissal of Brayog. "Moreau would make for Brayog to get away from these Bowron devils, wouldn't they? That's probably where they all are. Brayog's close to Moreau, and always ready for a fight." He held up a meaty fist. Davies grimaced. "Brayog? Pwah! Better Moreau made for the woods. The clan's worse than a few booyah devils. Savages and thieves. Everybody knows there's Gunder in their blood." Andelin saw the makings of an altercation and flashed a look at Marabas, who still sat next to her. She'd discovered earlier he was known as a Gunder. Marabas, however, didn't mind the insult that Davies had made no attempt to hide. Daniel glared from the kitchen. "I hate Davies." Fergus laughed. "I know you do. He's out there right now saying Brayog's got Gunder blood." Fergus held out a potato to him. "Here, see if you can hit him in the mouth." Daniel reached for it, and Fergus pulled it away, amused to have been taken seriously. "Daniel, don't waste a good potato on Davies." Fergus tossed the spud back in the sack and went to tend his coals. Daniel swiped his hand through the air at Davies, as if to say, "Forget you." Then he picked up a rag and twisted it. "Where's Uncle John? How come he didn't come over here before some sailor?" "I'm sure he's in that church, boy. Kneeling." Fergus stepped on a clever pedal beneath his grills basin, and the rack rose up on a pole in the center, exposing the coals. Jacob's work. Fergus said, "Trouble in Moreau, devils, sailors. This is all going to require hours and hours of kneeling." He pulled his chin into his throat, trying to look stuffy. Something's happened, old boy. We'd better kneel and give that some thought." "Ah!" He turned the coals with his poker and tossed in a piece of apple wood. "Don't worry, he'll come." Then, grinning, added, "At the very least, to eat." Daniel frowned at him. Davies smirked at Andelin. "So you'll be staying here, then?" She kept a polite tone. "I will, as long as they choose to extend their hospitality to me." He set his mug in front of her and leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. "Well, get us a drink then, dearie. I'm dry." Jacob chuckled at his friend's mischief and watched Andelin for a reaction. A few men in the room did some chortling and some ooh-wooing. She was speechless. Here was this milkman, relaxing and smirking, hoping she would do something rash, like throwing the mug at him. She saw it. Davies enjoyed causing people to lose their tempers, especially women, and considered it a great victory when he did so. Andelin stood, picked up his mug, and took it toward the kitchen. Sarah scooted after her. "Wow, I thought you were going to throw it at him." Andelin said, "Would that have been the appropriate response? What you would have done?" "I guess. I don't know. No, not really. But I would have liked to see someone else do it. I'd have at least cussed him, and I for sure wouldn't get him the drink." Sarah had mixed feelings about Davies. Her sister, Beth, was married to him. Andelin smiled. "It is comforting to know that my initial impulses were not out of the ordinary here." Daniel had been watching from the kitchen, and kept a frown on Andelin as she entered. When she picked up the cider pitcher to refill the mug, Daniel's mouth fell open in disgust. "Don't get Davies a drink. He's a rascal. All he does is talk mess. You should have shot him with your pisser." The kitchen went silent. Those things on her hips had been the subject of conversation earlier. Andelin corrected him. "Pistol." Fergus grinned from the grill. Davies sent you to wait on him? That's rich. Why are you doing it? Andelin looked into the empty pitcher. Unsure of the possible consequences to a visceral response, I chose one that I thought, cross-culturally, could not be considered offensive. Fergus paused. Oh, well. His smile returned. Let's put a beetle in it. Andelin laughed. I am still considering amendments to my position. She held up the pitcher. Fergus, where may I refill this container? Fergus said, Margot's out back, tapping a cask. Come on, I'll show you. Andelin followed him out, trailed by Sarah and Daniel. The cauldron marked north on Antioch's outer ring, and was one of the newest buildings in the city. 100 yards of apple trees separated it from the deeper forest. A small open yard connected it to a little cottage and a shed. The cottage was Margot's cider house, and Fergus used the shed for smoking meats. Evening was lowering into night. As they crossed the yard, Fergus sent Daniel to check the woodpile for a beetle or a spider. A big wriggly one! Daniel obeyed him like a grim soldier. The rest of them entered the cider house. The spicy scent of apples and alcohol sat in the stone and boards. One wall was a deep rack of casks in the candlelight. Margot looked up at them from where she worked. Fergus! What's happened? Fergus was amused. Davies sent our sailor to get him a drink, and she's doing it. What? Margot stood up and put her fists on her hips. Davies! The spleen on him! I'll tell him where to go to get a drink. She clucked her tongue at Andelin. Oh, dear, you shouldn't let a man treat you like that. Andelin was amused, too. I am educating myself in local custom by way of this adventure. The 5 of them returned to the common room as a pack, Andelin at their lead, holding the mug. She put it in front of Davies and sat. The others stood behind her, waiting. Davies was in conversation and hadn't noticed them yet. Jacob tapped his arm and pointed them out. It's the end for you, brother. Davies looked up, surprised. Margot put her fists on her hips. You should be ashamed of yourself. Davies! She declared his name, accusing him of being who he was. You should be ashamed, sending her to get your drink. Margot had the whole room's attention then. Davies was in trouble. Davies laughed. I didn't think she'd do it. I was just ruffling her feathers a little. Margot said, Oh, I know exactly what you were doing. Where's Beth? She's at home with our 5 fine sons, of course. She thinks we're being invaded. I'm here to get the lay of the land and to protect my family. At the look of indignation on Margot's face, Davies laughed again and slapped the table. With your mug and a mug, pouring sauce on our guests. Well, you've got your drink now, so drink it. Margot pointed her finger at it, like it was a fitting punishment for him. Davies shrewdly looked the 5 of them over. Margot's indignation, Daniel's hate, Sarah's confusion, and Fergus' anticipation. Andelin's face was a wall. Davies said, Fergie, what'd you put in this? Fergus raised his hands innocently. Davies declined the suspicious beverage. No, thank you. I've had enough for the evening. Then he feigned injury at Andelin. You tattled on me? Andelin raised the eyebrow again. I apologize. Had he been flirting with her? She couldn't tell. She wondered if Davies would treat her differently if he knew she was old enough to be his mother. Probably not. Davies held out his hand and said, Welcome to Antioch. She took it. Then he said, It's all right. I've got a mean woman at home as well. He looked to Margot. Isn't that right, Gran? Margot was only 38, but Davies had made her a grandmother 5 times. They were some of his greatest victories. Margot said, Cheeky devil. I'd better not catch you with an odd lip to these sailors, Davies. They've been through too much to be sassed by the likes of you. She narrowed her eyes on him before going back through the kitchen. Sarah, Fergus, and Daniel followed her. Sarah said, I don't understand why Andelin didn't stick up for herself. Are the women cowards overseas? Fergus said, That's rude, Sarah. Besides, I think she didn't she? Daniel said, Huh? Davies told her what to do and she did it. That was awful. After Margot was gone, Davies taunted Andelin again. You yellow-crested tattletale. I guess pants don't make you a man, do they, sailor? Andelin said, They do not. Then she picked up the suspicious mug, the one Davies had ordered and had then refused, and she drank. Jacob smiled. Wow, I like sailors. With strength that hammered steel for the circle, Jacob gave Davies a playful shove. It almost tipped the milkman out of his chair. Davies laughed and kept his balance. Near 11 o'clock that night, the cauldron cleared down to family, and the doorbell finally stopped ringing. Andelin was already asleep upstairs. Margot had instructed her to bring some friends, especially that handsome Biggs, to dinner the next day. Daniel sulked at the long table by himself. John never came. Fergus entered from the narrow hall, wiping his hands with a rag. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sure he'll come tomorrow. He's got very important things to do right now. Daniel didn't want to hear it. After listening to Andelin's stories, he knew John wasn't coming back. He knew because he'd seen the Bowron and their terrible truth. John would have to abandon him to face them. Fergus patted the boy's shoulder. Poor devil. The end of a conversation followed Sarah out of the kitchen as she swept through the common room. She said, "Bethenfords, you!" and bounced up the stairs without looking twice at Daniel. Margot called after her. "Andelin's bringing them to dinner tomorrow, dear, so get some clean clothes ready for her. Ooh, I hope she doesn't bring too many friends. Fergus, don't forget to lock the door. Those sailor stories are giving me the heebs and jeebs." Fergus sighed and pulled the latch. "We never used to lock the door." That is the end of Chapter 9. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99, or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for Chapter 10, The Circle.